Right then, how many of you are familiar with John Haywood?
Yeah.
Right. For those who are not familiar, he's an author and researcher. He's been doing this since 1997. He's got 7 books to date. He's probably best known for his falsification of history, which covers a hell of a lot of subjects. It's a bloody big volume, which goes into anything from the truth behind Princess Diana, the real events behind the Titanic, or Olympic as it's really called, or it was, the banking industry, World Wars I and II, etc. And just shows you what a sham history is based on the narrative we've been fed. His latest book is The Falsification of Science, which goes into a lot more controversial subjects, flat Earth being one of them. That's a better reaction than I expected. About the falsification of evolution, how macroevolution is basically one of these lies that ties into Big Bang Theory, and, well, that's another colossal bloody lie, nobody's ever seen a dinosaur. So, he's got another couple of books in between, which is what brings us here tonight, which is the Behind the Curtain Volumes 1 and 2, which is more of the same, looks at the history of the banking industry and how it plays its part. Enjoy the utopia. So, I'm going to hand it over to John. So,
cheers, mate. Right, I'm going to sit down because I'm an idle bastard. So, so as Pete said, yeah, this is what you're going to see now is taken from my book Behind the Curtain, which is a massive 2-volume tome on. Okay, I mean it's described as being about the banking industry, and it is about the banking industry, to be fair, but it's mainly about how the banking industry has been able to finance all the crap that goes on. And I don't just mean what's going on today, I mean what's been going on for decades and decades. So, yeah, let's launch into it. I call it the there's my book. That's volume 1 of Behind the Curtain. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I get being accused of this all the time. Okay, I'm just a conspiracy theorist apparently, so nothing that I say or do is worth anything at all. So just take it all with a pinch of salt, you know, as you do. Yeah, but again, oh sorry, that seems to have gone off the screen. I don't understand that. But anyway, again, I always say this. Not only am I a conspiracy theorist, I've also been accused of being a racist, misogynistic, homophobic, Holocaust denying, COVID denying, anti-vaxxer, and a climate change denying, anti-science, flat earth loony, and extreme right-wing terrorist. So that's me in a nutshell. Thank you very much for that. Right, okay, yeah, I mean, I think we all know what conspiracy theorists are regarded as, but yeah, I mean, I find that particularly apt. Yeah, it's nothing more than a derogatory name for a critical thinker, basically.
I think it's a badge of honour these days.
Tells you you're talking to an idiot.
Yeah, and again, it's a term used by the mainstream to slander anybody who questions their monopoly on the truth. Okay, a little quote there from Mark Twain, which is obviously very apt again. It's easy to fool people and to convince them they've been fooled. And another little quote here, which I found quite appealing to my wicked sense of humour. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you right off. And some of you may be aware of Charlie Robinson, who's a researcher who does similar stuff to myself. It is the banking cartel that controls the world, with money acting as the glue that keeps the whole thing together. I just thought that was very apt, you know, to what we're going to be talking about. So why Behind the Curtain? Okay. Now, this came from a quote from a judge in that case that I mentioned there, which was the U.S. Federal Reserve versus Daley in 1968 in Minnesota. And what happened was that Daley was a lawyer who actually questioned the validity of his own mortgage, and it went to court, and he actually won. And really, what that should have done, it should have toppled the entire fraudulent mortgage and loan system. But following that, several other people tried to do the same, and this particular judge said, if I allow you to do that, it's going to bring the whole banking system down, so we are not going behind that curtain. So that's where I got the title Behind the Curtain from. And that judge was later murdered. He was poisoned a few months after that statement. Yeah, no, the judge from the Daly case was later murdered, not the one who made that statement about not going behind the curtain. So, yeah, guess how many judges have taken up that option to find against the bank since then? Correct. Right, so just to give you a little bit of background, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the history of money first of all. So please bear with me while I go through that. Some of it is interesting. Other bits you may find tedious, I don't know. But it's all essential to understand what's going on now and what will be going on in the future. So part one is about how it all began. Part two is about the current banking system and how it enslaves us, if you like. And part three is about what we need to expect in the future. Okay. Oh, it's working. All right, okay. So first of all, the beginning of the monetary system was barter. We all know what barter is. It's trading a cabbage for a cauliflower, or trading, some eggs for a pound of bacon or whatever. So there was no money as such. It was just simply trading of goods. But that obviously had its disadvantages. And then we moved on to tally-sticks, what we call tally-sticks. Again, I'll come on to explain those in a little bit more detail. And then we went on to precious metals. Then we saw the advent of the goldsmiths in the early medieval times. And modern banking was actually formed in the 17th century. And we'll go through each one of these separately now. Okay. Obviously, barter is trading goods without money, as I said. Had several advantages. Let's be fair. It was a fair exchange of commodities. There was no middlemen. It was just a simple, straight swap deal, and nobody was making profits out of it. So, yeah, the other advantage, of course, is that each piece of commodity that was traded did have an intrinsic value, unlike modern money, as you should come on to see. Okay, and no one's cheated as a result. Okay, and what I mean by that, it's impossible to develop disproportionate status, is that there is no way that someone can profit from the barter system, okay, unlike the modern banking system whereby we're fraudulently cheated out of our money and, so, yeah, the disadvantages of that, of course, are that it's inflexible. For example, it's not possible to trade a pig for a bag of carrots. That is disproportionate stuff. Exactly, yeah. A cow for a cabbage, in fact. And it's impossible to save up for the future. Okay, so it's just to live on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so yeah, these are the tally sticks that I mentioned. Has anybody heard of tally sticks? Yeah. So okay, for those who don't know what a tally stick is, basically it was a piece of wood, like a part of a tree branch, and they used to split it down the middle and before they did that, they used to make notches in it and split it down the middle. One person would have one half and the other party would have the other half. So it was not possible to counterfeit it for that, because two different people had each half of it, which were identical. So, and these were allocated values, just like money in a sense, like a £20 note or a £10 note or a £50 note. But it was impossible to counterfeit because each party held separate halves of it. And again, no one can be cheated because of it. And again, that back to being impossible to develop that disproportionate status again, if you like. But obviously, it was hugely inconvenient carrying huge sticks around with you. It wasn't the easiest. Again, very inflexible, and these things were not transferable either. In fact, tally sticks were used right up until, I think it was the 17th century, strangely enough, but there you go. And then we moved on to precious metals, gold, silver, etc. Obviously, the advantage of using those as a currency is that it does have an intrinsic value. So a gold coin is obviously valuable, again, unlike the paper currency we use today. Impossible to counterfeit. It's not impossible exactly, but You can't counterfeit gold. You could counterfeit a coin, but you can't counterfeit the gold itself that it's made from. Again, no one's cheated. And again, it's impossible to develop a less disproportionate thing using articles that have an intrinsic value. Okay. Obviously, the disadvantages are that it's very susceptible to theft. You know, you need to have a secure place to keep your gold and your silver. Exactly, and it's very difficult to transport. It's very bulky, of course, it weighs a lot. We know gold is obviously very heavy. Again, the advantage is that it's got an inbuilt intrinsic value. It's impossible to counterfeit. That it's susceptible to theft, obviously. Needs a secure location and difficult to transport. Okay, so this is enter the goldsmiths now. This is where the goldsmiths, who were the forerunners of the bankers today, this is where they came into being. Because they said, oh, don't worry, we've got lots of nice safes we can keep all your gold in, and don't worry, because we'll give you a receipt for your gold, and you know, so you don't have to worry about it at all. So what happened was they actually began to issue what we now know as currency notes. Okay, which when in those times it was a promise to pay the bearer, which it still says on modern notes. But at that time, that was really true. Obviously, it's not true anymore. But at that time, it was a promise to pay that person that sum of money in gold. So everything was backed by gold. But this is the beginning of usury. And what do we mean by usury? The Oxford Dictionary today defines it as the action or practice of lending money at unreasonably high rates of interest. However, it wasn't always like that. Okay, usury meant something different, slightly different, subtly different, and that was the unreasonably high rates of interest was added at a later date. It used to be simply the action or practice of lending money at interest. But now the Orwellian language has kicked in and it's become unreasonably high rates. Okay, so basically, welcome to the world of the banksters, the people who run the monetary systems with an iron fist, encased in a velvet glove. Banksters is an interesting term, actually. Somebody in the 1930s coined it, and basically it's a conglomeration of two words, bankers and gangsters, and that's very, very appropriate. Okay, you've obviously all seen this meme before. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Okay, and this has now evolved into this one. Give a man a gun and he can rob a bank, give a man a bank and he can rob the world. And this is absolutely true, of course, and we shall see how. Okay, so let's move on swiftly to modern banking and how that works. Okay, what is a central bank? Does everybody know what a central bank is? Some people maybe not. Okay, central bank is like the Bank of England. It's like the Federal Reserve. It's the currency issuing bank. Okay, so when the government wants to inject, say, I don't know, £100 million into the economy, it goes cap in hand to the central bank, who, by the way, is not a government institution. They're all private monopolies. And the government goes cap in hand to them and says, can you let us have £100 million worth of currency? And the central bank says, yes, of course we can, Mr. Johnson, or whoever asking for it. But we'll need £100 million worth of treasury bonds in return for that, which do have an intrinsic value. Whereas the 100 million that they give the government to put into circulation is only worth however much it costs for the paper and the ink. There is absolutely nothing backing it whatsoever. So, I mean, that in itself is fraud. Okay. Yeah, so I've obviously gone ahead of myself there. But, yeah. Now, the first central bank was the Bank of Amsterdam in the 1630s. And this was rapidly followed by the Bank of England in 1694. Now, there's an interesting little story attached to how the Bank of England came about. And it concerns actually the English Civil War, believe it or not, which obviously happened in the mid-1600s. And I'm talking about the war where the Cavaliers fought the Roundheads and King Charles I was beheaded, that particular one. Now, the Jews had been expelled from England in 1290 by King Edward II. And the reason that they were expelled was not what you hear in the mainstream. It was basically because of their rituals of child sacrifice and of the fact that they lent money at interest. In other words, they were usurers. And the Christians rebelled against that. And so the end result of that, after a long period of time, was that they were actually expelled from England. Okay. Now, in the mid-1640s or the early 1640s, Oliver Cromwell, who was fighting the war against the crown, King Charles I, he was approached by the Jewish bankers and asked to readmit Jews if he ever came to power. And he said, well, I can't do that because, at the moment the king's in charge and the king is dead against it. He didn't want it. So this actually led to Cromwell going against the king, and this was the cause of the English Civil War, believe it or not. This is not what you read in history books, but trust me, this is exactly what it was. Direct to civil war, as I say. And this also led indirectly to the deposing of James II, who was the son of Charles I. He was the younger brother of Charles II, and he was deposed in 1690 by William of Orange and Mary. Anyone who know that historical story about William of Orange coming over from Holland? He was financed by the Jews. The Jews wanted a slice of the action in England, and this is why they wanted to get back into the country. So they financed William of Orange's invasion of England. He landed in Devon in 1690, and there was a kind of a civil war, and William became the King of England. And 50 years after Cromwell was first approached by the Jews to be allowed to return to England because they wanted to be part of the massive money-making potential of having a central bank. 50 years after that, the Bank of England was formed in 1694. Okay, so let's move on to America in the 19th and early 20th century. There was 3 attempts at forming a central bank in America. The first was in the early 1800s, and that was called the First Bank of the United States. And the second one was the Second Bank of the United States. Now, both these failed. They never took off. So there'd been, for a few years, there was a massive clamour to get a central bank back into America. Because again, they knew exactly how that would work, and that it would make people lots of money. The people at the top, of course, not the ordinary people. And this is why it was so important to the elite, because it gave them the ability to create money from nothing. All they have to do is set the printing presses going.
He's being gypped up here.
So it gave them the ability to create money from nothing. And we'll talk about this in a little more detail very shortly. Okay. So by the turn of the 20th century, the banksters were becoming desperate to get this central bank in America. And the third attempt at the US central bank, I think we all know where this is going, was the Federal Reserve. Okay. The people of the US were totally opposed to central banks, but they mounted this massive campaign of disinformation and propaganda saying how the central banks would, solve all the financial problems. In I can't remember which year it was exactly, 1907 rings a bell, there was a massive bust in America, as opposed to a boom, financial bust. And a man called J.P. Morgan, whose name still lives on, actually bailed out the American government. He was so rich, he actually bailed out the American government. And the lie was told that to avoid this happening in future, we need a central bank. So the campaign went ahead on that basis. Okay, and obviously there were many powerful interests opposing the formation of the Federal Reserve. Not all of them benevolent, but nevertheless there was a growing campaign opposing this this Federal Reserve. Now, one of the main protagonists was a guy called Charles Lindbergh Sr. You may have heard that name, but he was actually the father of the famous aviator, the guy who flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Channel. Across the Atlantic. He was the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, but that was his son. This was the father. Okay. Another guy was called Benjamin Guggenheim. He was a very wealthy American industrialist at the time. He was into mining and railways, one or two other vested interests that he had. A guy called John Jacob Astor, who was regarded as the richest man in the world. But again, we have this situation now, don't we, where the real rich people never appear on any rich lists. I mean, Astor was certainly nowhere near as wealthy as the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds, but he was touted as being the most wealthy man in the world at that time. And another guy called Isidor Straus, who was part of this team as well. He owned Macy's department store in New York, and he got a lot of banking interests as well. And these people were vehemently against the formation of the Federal Reserve. And so, that begs the question, of course, why were they opposed to the formation of the Federal Reserve? Well, I mean, for a start, they were very, very, very rich men, 4 of the richest men in the world, if you take away the Rockefeller and Rothschild dynasties. Okay, now they knew that the Federal Reserve Plan would actually undermine their own fortunes. And why would it do that? It would do that because inherent with any central banking system is extreme inflation. The way that it works just causes massive inflation. And they knew that their fortunes would be eroded. And possibly it could even destroy them as far as they were concerned. So they weren't doing this through any altruism or for any concern for the people or the welfare of the country. It was because they didn't want their own fortunes destroyed, basically. Right. Now, here we go. This is what I talk about quite a lot, and that is the Titanic. Now, 3 of those guys, Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor, all died on the Titanic. Right. Now, so it's no coincidence, basically. I believe it was too dangerous to plan separate accidents for them, so they were all enticed onto the Titanic. I cover this in my book, RMS Olympic, which tells the real truth about the Titanic sinking. And believe me, for those who are not aware, it's not at all the story that you believe it to be. Okay, it was too dangerous to plan separate accidents. And who would suspect that in the aftermath of a disaster that they'd actually been murdered? Now, it's true that none of their bodies was ever found. Well, sorry, one of the bodies was found, but the other, no one knows what happened to them after the incident where Titanic allegedly hit an iceberg, which I absolutely doubt, but that's another story for another day. Nobody knew what happened to them in the aftermath, and only one of their bodies was found, and that was John Jacob Astor, and he was found 3 days later floating in the Atlantic with $10,000 in his jacket pocket, and his face was battered to a pulp. It was unrecognisable. This is true. I mean, this is not me making this up. This is actual fact. This is even in the mainstream. His face was battered to a pulp. It was only recognisable by the contents of his pockets, basically. So, basically, without that serious opposition, the creation of the US Federal Reserve went ahead almost completely unopposed. Here's a quote by a guy called Benjamin Fulford, who some of you may have heard of. I don't particularly rate the guy very much, but at least this statement is pretty true. He said the Titanic was sunk deliberately to get rid of senior financiers who were opposed to the taking over of the Federal Reserve Board. So on the 23rd of December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was quietly passed by Congress when more than 3/4 of Congress had gone home for the Christmas holidays. Where have we heard this story before? Yeah. And this, of course, was the beginning of the American national debt, which is now, this was as of last week, by the way, it's now $29 trillion. Who is that money owed to? Who is that money owed to? Yes, it's owed to the bankers. It's owed to the owners of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is neither federal nor is it a reserve. It is privately owned company, just as the Bank of England is, and just as all the other central banks are. And who owns all the central banks in the world, apart from three? Thank you. The Rothschilds, of course. And importantly, the formation of the Federal Reserve Bank also had the effect of enabling bankers to fund World War I. Now, World War I, believe it or not, had been planned since about 1890 or even the late 1880s. But of course, with the ability to create money out of nothing, out of thin air, this gave them the funding. So they could fund both sides, as they always do in every war. They fund both sides and reap the interest payments. So they've been planning World War I for a long, long time. Okay, as I said, inherent within the central banking system, money is created from absolutely nothing through something called fractional reserve banking. Now, fractional reserve banking is their ability to create money based on a 10%. So if they let's say they have, just use simple figures, they have £1 million to lend, they can actually lend 10 million. These are the rules of fractional reserve banking. And that just continues on and on and on and repeats itself. I mean, I won't go into all the technical details of fractional reserve banking, but this is how they control governments. They restrict government spending when they wish, or they can create boom and bust cycles in effect. And this is what central bankers do. Okay, and this gives them this ability to create as much money as they like, gives them the power to do almost anything. And this is what the book Behind the Curtain is about. It's not just about the banking system, it's about how that has given them the funding to do all the other utter shit and crap that they do to us. And that, you know, of course, what we're seeing now today has been funded because they have unlimited amounts of money. Okay, and you know, let's not beat about the bush here. All mortgages, all loans are all fraudulent. Let me explain a little bit about that for those who are not aware. I'm sure some of you know, but just for those who don't know, and there's absolutely no shame in not knowing, because we're all being deceived all the time. But if you go to a bank and ask for, let's just use simple figures, to borrow 100,000 for a mortgage, they don't actually take that money from their account and put it into yours. All they do is they key it into a computer screen. So they just create £100,000 in your account. But that actual lump of money doesn't exist anywhere except in digital form on a computer screen. So yeah, and then they start charging you interest on money that didn't even exist in the first place. And the best bit for them is, of course, if you default on that debt, they come and take away your house, which does have an intrinsic value. So it's a win-win system. You know, I think we're all in the wrong occupations, to be honest. You know, and this is a famous quote from Henry Ford, which again is absolutely spot on. For those of you who can't read it at the back, it is well enough that people don't understand our banking and money system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. He's absolutely spot on. So, now modern money mechanics, where this quote comes from, is the manual, if you like, of the Federal Reserve banking system. Okay, so this is direct from the horse's mouth, if you like, from the Federal Reserve banking system. And I'll read it out again for those who are perhaps struggling to read it. What makes money valuable? Neither paper currency nor checking and savings deposits have value as commodities. Intrinsically, a dollar bill is just a piece of paper, deposits merely book entries. Coins do have some intrinsic value as scrap metal, but generally far less than their face value. What then makes these instruments, checks, paper money and coins, acceptable at face value in payment of all debts and for all of the monetary use? Mainly, it's the confidence people have that they will be able to exchange such money for other financial assets and for real goods and services whenever they choose to do so. So what, in a nutshell, that is saying, it's just purely your belief that that £20 note in your pocket is worth £20 that gives it value. There is absolutely no intrinsic value whatsoever to it, and it's not backed by anything of intrinsic value. It's just printed on a printing press, and it probably cost about 2p or even less for each note.
It's been like that for what, 10 years or so, since 2008.
It's been for a lot longer than 2008, Chris. Yeah, 1933. America came off the gold standard in 1933.
It's a fiat currency.
Fiat currency. Yeah, so in other words, in plain English, money's got no intrinsic value whatsoever, as I've just said, backed by nothing of value. It has as much value as the notes in the game of Monopoly. Okay, the only difference between those two notes is the belief, the absolute belief that one has got more value than the other. Okay, so that basically is the real value of fiat currency.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, okay.
How long, John, like on this thing?
And we're nearing the,
About 5 minutes or so?
yeah, something like that, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Why is it?
No problem. Just
Alright,
like,
okay.
so I've got an idea.
Right, okay, yeah. Sorry, yeah. What time is it now? Yeah, about 5 minutes or so.
People like to drinks.
Yeah, no, we're coming to the interval, Chris, don't panic. I know you're fed up of it already, mate, but...
Chris, if you want to get sloshed...
Yeah. So what does it actually mean? It means that money only has value because the issuer says that it has. And central banks, just to repeat myself, can create as much of it as they like at nothing to them, whenever they like. Okay. And central banks openly admit that the borrower creates his own money, so they are in effect lending money that doesn't belong to them and doesn't exist. I know I'm labouring the point here, but it's very important. Money or credit is only created by the signature of the borrower on his or her loan agreement. And they're all fraudulent because they simply, and believe it or not, this is absolutely true, when they issue you with that loan or with that mortgage, they don't debit that money from their side of the ledger, as they should do in double entry bookkeeping. They actually increase their side of the ledger with it. So rather than debiting it, they actually gain twice because they actually add it to the credit side. It's totally fraudulent. And as I said before, they just key the amount into a computer screen. It's not legitimate accounting, of course. Quite simply, it's what commonly known as... Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there you go. Why not get a mortgage? Yeah, it's 100% slavery guaranteed, assured servitude rate, and frauds. We only lie to get rich. So, in effect, they're lending us our own money.
Is this
because
from SUKV trust accounts? Is that what actually typically to
No,
no.
no, that's something else.
The money's actually created by nothing, by our signatures on a form. So when you sign your mortgage form or your loan form, that actually creates that money, for want of a better word. Okay. And
you as the security, you signed you as a security for them.
Not even you.
Wait, can we come back to this at the end?
Sorry, Chris. I did ask if I could ask a question at the end, if that's all right, because it's very distracting when you're trying to. Yeah. So it's all right. If we default, then just remove our assets, as I said, thereby taking something that does have an intrinsic value. So, as I said before, it causes rampant inflation, which is a hidden tax on us all. As you know, inflation is probably the greatest tax of all. The rich get richer, poor get poorer, and again, it enables to fund anything they like. You know, companies can expand their corporate, influence, get a never-ending cycle of wars. I thought that was quite amusing, actually. For those that can't remember it, those that can't read it, it says, "I am a member of a species that thinks working 5 days a week for 40 years to pay off a debt on a bank's computer screen is freedom." So somebody actually wrote that on a £20 note and put it back in circulation, which I thought was quite amusing. Okay, and some of you may have heard of Ron Paul, who until recently was a US senator. it's no coincidence that the century of total war, i.e. the 20th century, coincided with the century of central banking. And a little quote from the Rothschild brothers' mother: "If my sons did not want war, there would be none." How the world really works. And this, of course, is why all Iranians are terrorists, and also North Korea and Cubans, because they have central banks that the Rothschilds don't own, and they're the only 3 in the entire world that aren't owned by the Rothschild family. Okay. Now, again, I'll read this out to you. This is something that Thomas Jefferson said, who was the 3rd president of the US. He said that, "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around these banks will deprive the people of all their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent that their fathers conquered. The issuing power of currency should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." Well said, Thomas. Okay, and this is Ben Bernanke, who was one time chief of the Fed. He said the US government has a technology called the printing press, or today it's an electronic equivalent, that allows it to produce as many US dollars as it wishes at no cost to them. Okay. And John Adams, who again was an early president of the US, there are 2 ways to conquer and enslave a country. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. And is anyone here surprised that we have a huge increase in national debt? This was as of last week. It's 2.5 trillion, the UK national debt. Again, it's owed, who's it owed to? It's owed to the shareholders of the Bank of England.
Could you pay that off with just one promissory note? Signed by...
I would, I'd do it tomorrow, yeah.
And we created it in the first place.
Yeah. Well, just do the same back to it.
Yeah. How does the national debt come about? I've already explained this, but I'll say it again. The government has to go cap in hand to the Bank of England and ask for the currency, and the Bank of England lends all the money to the government. And this is a key point that I've probably just glossed over, but the government also has to repay all the money that the Bank of England creates for it, plus interest. Yeah, so this is what creates the national debt and why it's owed to the bankers. So all new money is created with debt attached. And the only way to pay off this debt, which is just gets into craziness, is by asking for more money to be printed. So it's just a constant ongoing cycle. They create the money from nothing, they control governments, gives them the power to do anything, funding of war after war, and mortgages and loans are all fraudulent. So, as I said, we're in debt to the Bank of England to the sum of 2.5 trillion, and that's rising at more than £5,000 per second. So, interestingly, what do these almost unimaginable sums of money actually look like? Okay, so this is an interesting little diagrammatical representation of what these large sums look like. Now, these are all, remember, these are all $100 bills. Obviously, it's an American thing. But so imagine if that was £10,000, that pile will be twice as high because we don't have £100 notes. You know, they would be £50 notes. So that pile will be twice as high. So that's what $100 looks like at the top, and that's what $10,000 look like. Okay. Now that's what $1 million looks like. Yeah, you know, it's not that massive, is it? But you know, right? Okay. That's what $1 billion looks like, and that's what that's what 100 million looked like, the previous one, wasn't it? That's what 1 billion looks like. Those are all stacked on pallets, as you can see. And that's what $1 trillion looks like. And these are the kind of sums we're talking about, trillions. You know, people think, oh, million, billion, trillion, there's not much difference. But as you can see, there is a huge, massive difference. So, in summary, for that part, banks create the principal in the form of currency, but not the interest owed on their loans to government. And this creates an ever spiraling debt as more money is printed just to pay the interest owed to the banks too. £1 lent at 5% becomes £2 in 14 years, which means in effect that the money supply has to double every 14 years just to cover the interest payments to the banks alone. Okay, or to put it another way, every 14 years the bank takes as much money in interest from the government as the entire money supply that existed 14 years ago. Okay. Aldous Huxley said world bankers can make or break entire economies by controlling press releases of economic strategies. The elite are able to not only tighten their hold on this nation's economic structure, but can extend that control worldwide. Those possessing such power would logically want to remain in the background, invisible to the average citizen. Yeah, of course. Believe it or not, only 5 corporations own 99% of the Western media, so that is how they're able to fool us about anything. Well, not us in this room. I mean, we're not fooled by anything, are we? But all the other people who are not aware of this. And included in those 5 corporations are Reuters and Associated Press, where every single Western news media outlet gets its information from. Every single one. Same group of families own them all. So it's so easy for them to present this distorted view of reality. Okay, nice little meme about the wonderful BBC there, our national broadcaster. We are specialised in manufacturing disinformation on a scale you couldn't even begin to imagine, with a mouthpiece for your slave masters. Don't forget to pay your TV licence fee to receive our free propaganda 24 hours a day. Yeah. These are the lies that we'd like you to adopt as though you were own opinions. Without your misplaced trust in us, we couldn't indoctrinate your mind with the state's rhetoric. Okay, I think I've gone past halfway. I put a slide in.
Let's just...
We'll break there because I put a slide in that said break, but I have a feeling that it's kind of missed it somehow. So I do apologise, but yeah.
Can you just tell you what...
So about 15 minutes and then we'll come back and get settled, yeah?
Well, I've already explained that because I said part 1.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like, can I sit there a moment? I'll just close this up. Okay, so we've got part 2 coming up. Sorry about the technical problems at the beginning of that. But I'll end this broadcast now. Okay. Here's one part 2.